Standing in a Senate Judiciary hearing, Ted Cruz threw out numbers that should make everyone's head spin. $30 billion in Minnesota fraud, the Minnesota taxpayer as the largest funder of Al-Shabaab terrorists, organized crime syndicates operating across the state, massive, explosive, terrifying allegations. And sitting directly across from him was Robert Weissman, the co-president of Public Citizen, who did something Cruz clearly wasn't expecting. He asked for evidence. Show me the documentation. Show me the proof. Show me where these numbers come from. Because here's the problem. When you actually look at what federal prosecutors have charged, when you read what the former U.S. attorney who prosecuted the largest case has said under oath, when you check the 2019 legislative audit that already investigated the terrorism claim, Cruz's numbers don't just fall apart, they're fabricated. The Al-Shabaab connection, already debunked multiple times by the actual prosecutors who worked these cases for years. Watch as Cruz makes these wild allegations. Watch as Weissman exposes how shaky the foundation really is, and I'll break down the actual documented numbers and why this matters so much afterwards.
How broad was the fraud that was perpetrated in Minnesota?
We are still getting a handle on it, but it's all of the, not all of, but a huge segment of the child care programs, autism services, sober homes, emergency transportation, of 14 areas of Medicaid fraud, SNAP benefits. We are still, I would say, getting whistleblower reports, uncovering new vectors of fraud. We just discovered the adult day services and the assisted living. Those haven't been counted in the total so far. So I believe it's much broader than we currently know, and we will continue to expose it.
Is there any chance the elected Democrats in charge of the state were unaware of the fraud?
No. There have been credible whistleblower allegations, press reports, and Office of Legislative Auditor reports for many years.
Mr. Hoke, I want to thank you for your citizen journalism and your hard work pressing for accountability here. I will say I watched the video that you did with rapt attention. It was profoundly effective. It was also, by the way, an indictment of all of the so-called journalists on the national level, because none of them could be bothered to actually go and investigate. I want to ask you the same questions I asked Representative Robbins. Number one, how broad do you believe the evidence shows the fraud in Minnesota was?
It's easily in excess of $30 billion when you take everything into account. You've got all of these NGOs, you've got nonprofits, you've got county money, you've got city money, you've got CCAP money, you've got another thing called Great Start. So there are all these piles of money that factor into the fraud. I don't know that anybody can ever determine an exact number, but I kept telling the U.S. attorney when he came out, I said, you got to get your number up, you got to get your number up, and he did. He kept ratcheting up the number, and I kept saying, you got to be at least at $30 billion. So going back to whether Governor Walz knew about it, Governor Walz admitted knowing about the fraud early in his first term, which would say 2020. Well, Minnesota Statute 3.971, Subdivision 9, clearly says that if you are made aware of fraud in a state agency, you are obligated to immediately report that fraud to the Office of the Legislative Auditor. Immediately. The Legislative Auditor is then the body that determines which law enforcement agency to bring into the investigation. Governor Walz did not contact the Office of the Legislative Auditor. He said he contacted the FBI about what? That's not what the law says.
How many organizations receiving taxpayer funds did you visit in total?
How many?
How many organizations or ostensible organizations?
Companies? Yeah. 200.
Of the child care centers you visited, how many kids did you see?
The only place that I saw children was at KinderCare and New Horizons, which are, in my opinion, legitimate. They're large scale. They have play areas. And they also receive CCAP money, but they're the only places that I saw where there were children present, ever, at any of them.
How about the autism centers? Did you see children? Did you see patients there?
Never. So that's not to say there weren't any, but there were never any there. When I was there, never any footprints in the snow, same thing.
Mr. Weissman, you're co-president of Public Citizen, which describes itself as a consumer advocate and a pro-democracy organization. Would you agree that the fraud in Minnesota was staggering and shocking?
I agree that there is fraud in Minnesota. I don't believe these estimates are grounded in any evidence that I've seen. The $9 billion figure was based on a claim just that, well, I think that half of them must be fraudulent. I just heard a comment just saying, boost the number up. But to be clear, and with respect, you missed my testimony. No question there's fraud in Minnesota, and absolutely I share your righteous anger about whatever degree of fraud there was there.
Do you agree that any Democrat politician, or let me be clear, any Republican politician that had knowledge of the fraud and was complicit should be prosecuted?
I'm not sure what they're being prosecuted for, but also in my testimony, I described also outside of Minnesota the manifold ways that this administration is enabling fraud.
Look, I understand. The reason, hold on.
The standard is that you want
to prosecute. Sir, I'm going to ask a question, and then you can answer it.
Yes, sir.
Your organization describes itself as a pro-democracy organization. I'm going to try to find out if you actually are pro-democracy or if you're simply pro-Democrat and are a partisan. We've seen the Democrats who want to change the topic. So I get you want to testify how much you hate Donald Trump. But I'm quite certain Donald Trump was not running a fraudulent daycare center or a fraudulent autism center in Minnesota. So all of the talking points about how you dislike Trump, set them aside. We will see the Democrats on this committee go down those talking points. Do you believe elected politicians in Minnesota who were aware of this fraud and were complicit in it should be prosecuted? Should there be accountability?
There absolutely should be accountability. It is not normal to prosecute government officials for not prosecuting fraud. That is not a standard I'm aware of that you've advocated or that anyone else has advocated in the Senate.
So do you think it's perfectly okay?
I did not say
if let's say Governor Walz or Attorney General Ellison knew about the fraud, benefited from the fraud in terms of bundling votes, benefited from the frauds in terms of collecting campaign finance violations, and deliberately looked the other way. You think that's not criminal conduct?
In that hypothetical, it is not okay. 100% not okay. But also, if you'll permit me, that hypothetical is in fact happening throughout.
Okay, yes, I get it. You dislike Trump. I understand you dislike Trump,
sir. It is whether I have a standard of accountability.
So let me sir, please do not interrupt me. Please do not.
Being clear.
Please do not interrupt me. Please do not interrupt me.
Sir.
You may answer questions after I ask them. You've heard the evidence and testimony about daycare centers with no children, with no toys, with no facilities, with windows that are blacked out. Do you believe it is possible that the officials sending millions of dollars to those fake daycare centers and fake autism centers didn't know what was going on?
Well, what I heard was claims about that, and I too have watched the video. We're both parents. I'm glad that the child care centers don't open their door for someone who's knocking there. I don't view that as evidence that the child care centers are fake child care centers, although I'm sure there are some. My understanding is that state investigators have gone to do their duty at those exact same child centers and have found that most of them actually are operating correctly.
Well, I will say it is disappointing that you had a chance leading a nonprofit that is supposedly pro-democracy to take a principled stand. Instead, you decided to defend the Somali fraudsters because it benefits elected Democrats. That's disappointing. But you know what? I'm going to give you something you're going to like, an opportunity to say all the ways you dislike President Trump, because I'm going to recognize the ranking member who will surely ask you why Trump is terrible and do everything you and he can do to change the topic from the actual topic of this hearing. Ranking Member Whitehouse.
Before we get to that, I don't want to leave what seemed to be a pretty flagrant mischaracterization of your testimony without an opportunity for you to address that mischaracterization, if you would care to begin with that.
appreciate that. Just briefly, I was disagreeing with the premise of the question that we have been displayed this evidence showing criminal wrongdoing. Obviously, where there is criminal wrongdoing, and I testified to this, I support aggressive investigation and prosecution. To the degree there is wrongdoing in Minnesota, it should be aggressively investigated and prosecuted. I'm not sure that the claim that all the evidence we've been presented today is in fact evidence of that, but I don't deny it for a moment that it is occurring in Minnesota.
Let me ask you.
Let's be very clear about what you just witnessed. Ted Cruz stood in front of a Senate committee and claimed Minnesota fraud totals at least $30 billion, that the Minnesota taxpayer is the largest funder of Al-Shabaab, a designated Somali terrorist organization, and that this represents organized crime on a scale never seen before. And when Robert Weissman asked him to back up these astronomical claims with actual documentation, Cruz couldn't do it. He pivoted, he attacked Democrats, he got defensive, but he could not produce evidence for that $30 billion figure. Now, here's what they're not telling you. Let's talk about the actual documented fraud in Minnesota, because fraud absolutely happened and people absolutely should be prosecuted. The largest case is Feeding Our Future, a massive pandemic meal program fraud, according to the U.S. Department of Justice. Federal prosecutors charged 77 defendants and secured convictions for more than 60 individuals in a scheme that fraudulently siphoned approximately $250 million. That's the largest pandemic relief fraud scheme charged in U.S. history. Then you have other programs. Conservative analyst Bill Glann testified to the Minnesota House Committee that he's cataloged 27 fraud incidents since 2019, totaling approximately $611 million. Some estimates suggest housing stabilization fraud around $300 million, autism services fraud potentially $220 million, and various other schemes. So when you add everything up that's been documented or estimated by investigators, you're looking at somewhere between $600 million and maybe $900 million total. That's horrible. That's criminal. Every single person involved deserves prosecution, and many are already in prison serving long sentences. But $600 to $900 million is not $30 billion. Cruz is inflating the actual documented fraud by a factor of 30 to 50 times. Where does he get this number? From a preliminary non-finalized estimate that suggested more than half of $18 billion spent across 14 different programs since 2018 might be fraudulent. But that estimate is still under review, hasn't been audited, relies on projections rather than proven cases, and even if you took it at absolute face value, which you shouldn't, it still doesn't get you to $30 billion. And then there's the Al-Shabaab claim. This one's even worse because it's been actively, repeatedly debunked by the people who would actually know. Andy Luger, the former U.S. attorney for Minnesota, who served 2 terms and personally prosecuted the Feeding Our Future case with 70 defendants, told CBS News Minnesota explicitly, the vast majority of the money that these folks made went to spending on luxury items for themselves. There was never any evidence that this money went to fund terrorism, nor was there any evidence that was the intent of the 70 people we indicted. Luger told the Star Tribune, the defendants were looking to get rich, not fund overseas terrorism. And he would know. He prosecuted international terrorism recruitment cases involving Somali American men who sought to join ISIS. If there was terrorism financing happening, he would have charged it, but he didn't because the evidence doesn't exist. And it's not just Luger. Multiple federal investigators told CBS News there is no evidence taxpayer dollars were directly funneled to Al-Shabaab. And here's the kicker that completely destroys Cruz's claim. In all 98 individuals charged in Minnesota fraud cases, 0 terrorism charges have been filed. Not 1 count of material support for terrorism, not 1 conspiracy charge involving Al-Shabaab, not 1 terrorism financing statute invoked. If federal prosecutors had credible evidence of intentional funding of a designated foreign terrorist organization, terrorism statutes would almost certainly apply. They didn't charge it because the evidence doesn't exist. In fact, this exact allegation was investigated before. A 2019 Minnesota legislative audit examined claims that child care funds were reaching terrorists. The conclusion, the bottom line is that we couldn't substantiate it, said legislative auditor Judy Randall. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it doesn't mean it did happen. It's just that there wasn't enough evidence to definitively tie it. It's like if your neighbor got caught shoplifting from Target, and I stood up at a town hall and said, this proves that shoplifters have stolen $30 billion from stores nationwide, and they're funding international crime syndicates. When you ask me for proof of that $30 billion, I point to one arrest, cite an anonymous source from a blog, and when the actual police detectives who investigated say we found no evidence of that, I just repeat the claim louder on TV. That's not evidence, that's fear-mongering. So why is this happening? Why is Ted Cruz standing in a Senate hearing making these wild, easily disprovable allegations? Because this is part of a much larger pattern. Republicans right now are running hard on anti-immigrant, anti-refugee rhetoric. They need Minnesota to be their cautionary tale. Look what happens when Democrats let refugees in, billions stolen, terrorism funded, American communities destroyed. And Minnesota is the perfect target for this narrative because it has the largest Somali population in the United States. It's a Democratic state, and it's in the Midwest, which Republicans desperately need to win back. So they take real fraud that's being aggressively prosecuted. 98 charged, 60 convicted, more cases coming. And they inflate the numbers by 30 times, add completely debunked terrorism allegations, and use it to demonize an entire community of people who fled war zones and came here legally. But here's what makes this particularly insidious. Evidence doesn't matter to these people anymore. Robert Weissman sat there and said, Senator, these estimates are not grounded in any evidence I've seen, and Cruz didn't care. Former U.S. attorneys who prosecuted the actual cases said under oath there's no terrorism link, and Cruz cited an anonymous source from a conservative magazine article instead. That used to be disqualifying. If you made factual claims in a Senate hearing that you couldn't back up with documentation, you used to lose that argument. But now, Cruz will clip this hearing, show it on Fox News, and his base will see him exposing fraud and fighting terrorism. They won't hear that prosecutors debunked the terrorism claim. They won't hear that the numbers are inflated by a factor of 30. They won't hear that zero terrorism charges have been filed. All they'll hear is Somali, 30 billion, and Al-Shabaab. And that creates permission structures for discrimination, for hate, for violence against vulnerable people. The bottom line is this: investigate fraud wherever it happens. Prosecute everyone involved regardless of their background. Minnesota has been doing exactly that. 98 people charged, more than 60 convicted, sentences up to 17 years in prison, restitution being collected, more prosecutions coming. That's the system working. That's accountability happening in real time. But what Ted Cruz is doing isn't about accountability. It's about using fabricated numbers and discredited terrorism allegations to demonize an entire community for political gain. And when someone like Robert Weissman asks him to prove his claims with actual evidence, he can't do it because the evidence doesn't exist. And that should alarm every single person who cares about truth, about facts, about having a shared reality in our political discourse. If you appreciate this kind of detailed fact-checking with multiple sources, please hit that like button and subscribe. Turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos where we verify claims instead of just repeating them. Share this with someone who needs to see it. Thanks for watching. Bye.